Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. Last class, we talked about England seizing the New Netherlands from the Dutch and turning it into New York and East and West Jersey. So by 1702, the two proprietors of East and West Jersey, Berkeley and Cartier, had blown it. They both went bankrupt. So they had to turn their colonies back over to the British. And when that happens in similar fashion to a joint stock colony going bankrupt, it becomes a royal colony. And what the British government did in 1702 is they merged the two, East and West Jersey, and created the royal colony of New Jersey. So now we want to move on to a colony west of New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Many of you know quite a bit about Pennsylvania because William Penn's relatively famous, but let me tell you the background information of how William Penn ended up being the proprietor of Pennsylvania, which means Penn's Woods. Now, William Penn was a member of another religious group in England that was an offshoot of the Church of England. That's the Quakers. Now, the Quakers are completely different than the Puritans and the Pilgrims, the other two offshoots we've talked about, as the Quakers are, first of all, devout pacifists. So they're not going to go and plunder anybody like the Puritans did, and it's also going to allow them to get along pretty famously with the Native Americans that live in Pennsylvania. But I'm jumping ahead a little bit. So, also the Quakers are very different from the Pilgrims and Puritans because there's really not an organized clergy among Quakers. Quakers are of the philosophy that anybody who can read can interpret the Bible. So, to deliver their Sunday services, they'd take turns being more or less the pastor of the Quaker church or whatever, because anyone who could read could deliver a Sunday service. So they're really loose-knit compared to the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and they're very tolerant also. But a lot of that has to do with being pacifists. So, to William Penn. William Penn was a Quaker. He's from the famous Penn family in England, a very prominent, high-ranking social family who the British Crown owed favors to William Penn's father. So William Penn's father decided to call in a favor. He met with the Crown and said, hey, you guys are all familiar with my son, William. William was kind of the black sheep of the family because everybody else in the family was prim and proper, proud members of the Church of England, and William Penn's this Quaker. So, it's kind of an embarrassment to the family. So William Penn's father says, hey, could you do me a favor and grant my son a colony? If you do, I'll have him take every Quaker he knows with him, and Pennsylvania can be a safe haven for Quakers. So, you can see that England's got into this habit of exporting unwanted religious groups. And the next one to go is the Quakers. So the British government agrees, grants him a colony, and William Penn goes and starts the very successful colony of Pennsylvania with his Quaker comrades in 1681. And the Quaker colony, being a latecomer and, can learn from all the other colonies in the region, and also due to their pacifist nature and their friendly nature, because another word for Quakers is, quote, the friends, they're very, very successful right off the bat. But the one problem that William Penn knows he faces He's been given a gigantic land grant. Pennsylvania is a huge colony. And he's convinced just about every single Quaker he knows in the world to come there. But there aren't a heck of a lot of Quakers in existence. So what he's afraid of is the Brits are going to decide we gave him way too much land. We're going to take back part of that and give it to somebody else, maybe some unwanted neighbors who might not get along with the Quakers. So William Penn's riding around in the Pennsylvania countryside one day, and it dawns on him where to get more colonists from. William Penn went to college in Germany. And as he's riding around the Pennsylvania countryside, it dawns on him, boy, this countryside with these rolling hills and so forth looks just like the part of Germany where I went to college. So he has a brainstorm. In that area of Germany where he went to college were some other religious groups, the Mennonites and the Amish, who also were very peaceful people. So he decided, I'm going to travel to Germany. I'm going to recruit Amish and Mennonites to come to Pennsylvania and be colonists. And what will lure them there is I'll give them free land. And I can convince them because I'll tell them it's just like where you live now in Germany. The only difference is you'll own your land. Because, the majority of these Amish and Mennonites were peasant farmers who worked for the lord of the manor. So William Penn does just that, and he successfully lures over some pretty big numbers of Amish and Mennonite Germans. Now, that's also where another sort of misnomer, I don't want to call it a myth, but it kind of is. Most of you have probably heard of Pennsylvania Dutch country. It's in the rural areas, across the Delaware River from present-day Princeton, New Jersey, in that area. And Pennsylvania Dutch country is a big tourist attraction. A lot of people go there for its quaint shops and whatnot, and to buy Amish and Mennonite crafts and whatever. Now, the way it became known as Pennsylvania Dutch country is because when these new German immigrants showed up in Pennsylvania, there's another language barrier. The British Quakers are welcoming their new neighbors, and they're asking them about where they came from. And they're saying that they are Deutsch, and that they're from Deutschland, which is Germany in German. And they couldn't understand them, and they said, oh, you're Dutch. And it's a situation where I'm sure they just got tired of correcting them. So that's how they became the quote-unquote Pennsylvania Dutch. Pennsylvania Dutch country is all German culture. You don't see tulips and windmills. It's German culture, but it's called Pennsylvania Dutch. That's how it got its name, and it's stuck forever. So one other thing on William Penn in Pennsylvania, once the British government caught wind of this, sizable influx of Germans into Pennsylvania, they told William Penn to knock it off. No more recruiting Germans or any other mainland Europeans to your colony. Because the British saw the writing on the wall. In the future, if there's any sort of trouble in the colonies, for the most part, they can rely on the loyalty that the British colonies will have to their home country and to the British Crown. People from Germany or the Dutch have absolutely no loyalty to the Brits or the Crown. And they could be big trouble in the future. Namely, The writing on the wall is an American Revolution, where even people of British descent are fed up with royalty in the British Parliament. Not to mention how easy it'll be to convince somebody who is of German descent, Dutch descent, French descent, whatever it may be. So, William Penn, even though he has a highly successful colony, will end up spending his fortune he accumulated traveling back and forth from North America to England, fighting the British government in British courts. So he'll spend his fortune on transportation and legal fees. But he'll end up in the long run losing his fight, but he'll still stand up for the rights of Pennsylvania and its residents. Now, also a little side note about Pennsylvania, I mentioned that the Quakers are very religiously tolerant, and they're living side by side with different religious groups like the Amish and Mennonites and others, but they also had sort of their faults. In Pennsylvania, only Quakers could vote to elect elected officials and so forth. And if you weren't a Quaker, you had to pay a special small tax to the Pennsylvania government for the privilege of worshiping another religion besides the Quaker religion. So even though they're tolerant, that's not what we would consider religious freedom. So I want to just mention one other thing that's sort of another myth in early American history. I can remember being taught that the British came over here, many of them, in search of religious freedom, like the Pilgrims and the Puritans and the Quakers. Well, yes, they did. And also, as I pointed out, they were sort of helped along and exported by the British government to get them out of England, out of sight, out of mind. And once they got here, especially with the case of the Puritans and the Pilgrims, there was no religious freedom. You wanted to live in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you had to be a Puritan. You wanted to live in Plymouth Colony, you had to be a Pilgrim. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. They didn't welcome other religions. There was no freedom of religion there. And we saw what happened if you disagreed with them. Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson were told to leave. Puritans went to Maryland and murdered Catholics. And even the most progressive of religious groups, the Quakers, taxed others and didn't allow them to vote. That's not religious freedom in the minds of Americans, for sure. So this wasn't the land of religious freedom like I was taught in grade school. This better way to sum it up would be this was the land of religious segregation and religious cast-offs. So, what we want to cover next in our examination of the colonies that we're going to look at are the Carolinas. Now, the Carolinas were, when they were first established, there was no such thing as North and South. They were just all the Carolinas. And in 1681, two very prominent Brits, Sir John Colleton and Sir Ashley Cooper, and some of their friends, were granted a proprietary charter to start the Carolinas. So now things are moving south out of Virginia. It was slow to happen all the way to 1681 because Spain is just south of there. Spain is firmly entrenched in Florida. And if you don't know, you'll find out, Spain will control Florida all the way till 1819 when the United States purchases Florida from Spain. So, Spain and England are engaged in periodic wars. So British citizens were cautious about moving into the Carolinas because Spain and its explorers had been there and they had potential claim to that territory, and it could end up in conflict with Spain. But Cooper and Colleton were ready to risk it, and they start a proprietary colony in 1681. Now, originally, what they had decided to do after studying other colonial experiences that had happened, like Jamestown and Maryland and what's going on up in New England and whatnot, they decided that to save on costs that really cost, especially the Virginia Company, a big cost was recruiting colonists and shipping them across the Atlantic and treating them in the beginning sort of as paid employees. Cooper and Colleton decided what we'll do is we'll go up to New England where the population is growing very quickly and the price of land is skyrocketing. We'll offer free land grants to New Englanders in the Carolinas. And this is something that they will not be able to turn down, especially if we give them a free boat ride from Boston to Charleston or whatever. But that's a lot less expensive than shipping people all the way across the Atlantic and then paying them for a while. So they go up to New England, recruit colonists. They're pretty successful. Several boatloads come down, start clearing land in the Carolinas to start farming operations and so forth. But I suppose the best way to put it is these New Englanders who are used to a different climate, and before that they're used to the climate of England, that's why they like New England, will more or less wilt in the heat. Down, whenever you get a piece of property in, the New World or North America, present day, 13 colonies, one of the most difficult things you have to do in the beginning is clear all the timber off it. Because we know it's one gigantic forest. You got to cut all the trees, then you got to burn out the stumps before you can farm it. Very dangerous and also very laborious work. Can you imagine clearing land in North and South Carolina in the middle of the summer? I don't know if you guys have ever been there. My youngest daughter went to college at the University of South Carolina. In July and August, September in the Carolinas, it can routinely be between the 90 and 100 degrees with 90 to 100% humidity. It's horrendous. So these New Englanders more or less wilted in the heat. They couldn't take it. Most of them said, free land, no land, I don't care. I'm going back to New England. I'll buy land. So now Cooper and Colleton are kind of stuck. Their, plan A didn't work. So now they're thinking about, okay, where can we recruit colonists that can stand this heat? Both of them had friends in British holdings in the Caribbean, especially on a very successful British colonial island holding of Barbados. Barbados by the 1680s was a very prosperous sugarcane producing island. And the island was, basically one sugarcane plantation after another. So they contacted some of their friends and wanted to know if they wanted to expand their operations to the Carolinas. Because Cooper and Colleton thought sugarcane could survive there. So these settlers from Barbados took them up on the offer, especially when they're giving them free land and there was no more available land to purchase in Barbados. So they're going to come up and try to establish sugarcane operations. Now, When they arrived from Barbados, unfortunately, one thing that Cooper and Colton hadn't thought of, they're going to bring African slaves with them. That's the labor that they used in Barbados. This is going to be the first massive influx of African slaves in large numbers into the British colonies. Some slaves had come in to Jamestown in 1619 and after, but it was pretty limited. This is going to be a big influx. And Cooper and Colton hadn't even got permission for this. But it's the same situation. You're a long way from London. You don't have time to ask permission of the British government. You sort of turn your head and let this take place. Even though they should have had permission, because England at the time was debating whether or not to just eliminate the institution of slavery, not expand it. So, they unload their ships, start setting up sugarcane plantations. The plantations fail. It gets too cold in the winter in North and South Carolina. Sugarcane can't survive. In January in South Carolina, it'll get down into the 20s, which is too cold for sugarcane. But what they discovered very quickly is there were other prosperous means in the Carolinas. One was growing rice. And rice worked perfectly with slave labor because it's a very labor-intensive crop. So they quickly turned their sugarcane operations into rice operations. Another very prosperous enterprise that happened in the Carolinas, in the interior, there's a lot of open sort of plain type land in the interior. Perfect for grazing cattle. So the interior of especially North Carolina became, the British colony's first cattle country, which was a very prosperous operation. Then the other very prosperous operation in the Carolinas has to do with the small pine trees that are native to the Carolinas. They're known as Loblolly Pines. Loblolly pines, unlike the pines up here in the North Country, only grow to a height of about, 40, 50 feet max. They don't get very big. But the one thing that they have going for them is they're really full of what's known as pine pitch. You all are familiar with pine pitch. You break a branch off a pine tree and this gooey substance comes out that's kind of like sap, but they call it pine pitch. Pine pitch is very valuable because pine pitch can be turned into a substance that was of strategic nature to the British Navy. Tar. Tar was a strategic commodity to all navies because remember, back in this day and age, all navies are wooden. All wooden ships leak. And back in this day and age, what they would do is cover the hulls on the outside and inside with tar, which waterproofed them. So tar was very valuable to the British Navy, and they could sell every bit of tar that they produced out of these loblolly pines right to government contracts. Plus, tar is the base ingredient for oil paints back then because you can make a substance known as turpentine out of it. So this makes the Carolinas very prosperous pretty quickly, which leads us to our final colony we want to talk about today, the colony that will be formed south of there, Georgia. Now, people were really, really cautious about going to Georgia because Georgia was sort of no man's land in between Spanish Florida and now the prosperous British Carolinas. And really, how are you going to recruit somebody to come and settle a area of land that if war begins between Spain and England, it's going to be the first place invaded. So really what they're trying to create here is sort of like a military buffer zone between the prosperous Carolinas and Spanish Florida. So how do you get people to come and settle there? Here's how. The British create a penal colony. At this point in British history, there had been an economic downturn. And during this period in British history, there's no such thing as a common person like you or I declaring bankruptcy. If you couldn't pay off your debt to somebody, you went to debtor's prison. So, at this point, due to the economic downturn, the debtor's prisons, where you'd have to work in these, work environments to pay off your debt in a prison setting, were bursting at the seams. So now the British decide, we'll give these debtors a choice. They can either go to debtor's prison in England, or they can go and become colonists in Georgia. If they take the Georgia option, we'll give them 50 acres of land, and they have to give a portion of their profits to the person that they're indebted to until they work off their debt. Plenty of people took up the British government on this offer. Who the hell wants to go to a dingy debtor's prison where at least you can be free somewhere in farming and ultimately own your own land? So, the person they put in charge of Georgia, which was founded in 1732 as a penal colony, was James Oglethorpe. He was a big reformer of prisons, and he saw this as a great reform. Now, there were some other rules that applied to the early Georgians. They got 50 acres of land, but two things were in place. It was a dry colony. No alcohol allowed, sort of as a punishment factor. Plus, there were no slaves in Georgia. So, pretty quickly, people in Georgia started making one demand. They needed more land. 50 acres wasn't enough to make a living and pay off a debt, because you got to remember, back in this day and age, crop yields are much less per acre than they are today. And they were right. So, finally, they upped the ante to where you could acquire up to 500 acres of land to make a real go of it. Then you know what the next demand's going to be. We need slaves like our neighbors to the north in the Carolinas. How in the world can my family and I work 500 acres of land? We need help. Well, obviously, we'd say, hire someone. But back in this day and age, unfortunately, there's the phenomenon of slavery. Then, obviously, once they start to become pretty prosperous, they're going to open it all up. It's not going to be a dry colony anymore. And pretty quickly, the original settlers will pay their debts off, and Georgia will become a thriving colony. So, that's it for that lecture. We've finished our examination of colonies. So next, I'm going to introduce you to some things that are in Chapter 4 on the century of conflict that exists between France and England. So I'm going to take another break. I'll be back with you shortly to get you going on the century of conflict. So, see you soon.